November, the town of Whitmore. Everyone else left the office hours ago. Only one man remains, not the owner, not a partner, not anyone whose name gets mentioned at the end of a long day. Just a man who tries to do his work correctly, a man no one notices, a man no one thanks, and yet he stays. Perhaps you know him. Perhaps tonight he is you. Welcome. This is Deep Sleep Tales. This is a place for stories that belong to no particular moment, slow voices, low lights, and a narration that will carry you without hurry toward sleep. Tonight we are going somewhere specific. Northern England, 1888, a wet November night where the gas lamps burn with a trembling gold and the last carriages stopped running hours ago, and every bakery is locked and dark. We are going there now, slowly, together. Wherever you are right now, a quiet bedroom, a corner of a city that has finally gone still, or simply someone who is carrying today's weight but trying, gently to set it down. We are glad you're here. If these nights do something good for you, leave a word in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from. This small community means something to us, and a quiet like on the video if you feel it matters more than you might expect. Now, make yourself a little more comfortable. There is nothing you need to do, and nothing you need to become. Let your body settle. Feel its weight, the way it presses into the mattress or the chair beneath you, the fabric against your skin. Let your head rest fully into the pillow. Pull your blanket a little closer, around your shoulders, your neck. Now let your shoulders drop. Do it consciously, deliberately, with real permission. Whatever you carried today, set it down. This is not its hour. Breathe in slowly. Hold it. Let it go. Whatever happened today is finished. It will not open again. Whatever comes tomorrow is far away, too far to reach tonight. Right now there is only this voice, this dark and the quiet that is already waiting for you. Close your eyes. Follow this sound. I am going to take you somewhere. Grain Street ran north to south through the middle of Whitmore, and it wore each season like a different mood. Dusty and sun-warmed in summer, its stones radiating heat long after the light had gone, muddy and blinking in spring, with cart ruts filling overnight, and the smell of new mud rising each morning like something alive. But in November, in exactly this November, it belonged entirely to rain and gaslight, and the faint thread of coal smoke drifting down from the chimneys of houses that had already closed themselves against the dark, a street with a gentle melancholy to it, the kind that settles over places after long years of ordinary life conducted without fanfare, the kind of street that asked nothing of you and offered everything quietly, if you were the sort of person who noticed quiet things. All the shops along Grain Street had closed hours ago. The greengrocer with its wooden crates stacked and brought inside, the printer with its rollers stilled and its ink smell locked behind the door, the cobbler and the small stationer's with its careful window display of ledger books and pen boxes, arranged as though someone had given the matter real thought, each one shuttered and dark now, the boards down, the gas inside extinguished, the glass behind them black and still and indifferent, and walking past them that evening, you would have seen nothing but your own rain-blurred reflection sliding across the darkened panes, and heard nothing but the water running steadily off the eaves in long unbroken threads, and the particular hollow sound of a street from which all human activity has departed and left only itself behind, all except one building. Midway along the street, 3 stories of deep red brick stood with its facade worn pale by decades of November rain, exactly like this one, the mortar between the courses stained dark in long vertical streaks where the water ran each year, following the same paths it had always followed, the ground floor shutters cracked from old winters and patched in summers past.
The wood soft at the lower edges where damp had settled and found purchase over time, and above the door a bronze plaque that had once read Callaway and Associates Accountancy in clean, proud letters. But the years had filled the grooves with lime and grime until the C was nearly closed and the ampersand had all but vanished, and any passing stranger who tried to read it would have given up somewhere in the middle and moved on, which was perhaps as accurate a summary of the building's reputation as any.
But anyone who paused and looked up at the first floor would have noticed something worth noticing at the far end of a long, narrow corridor, through a door left slightly open, behind the rain-streaked glass of the window that faced Grain Street. A light was burning, small, yellowish, steady, not the restless flicker of a gas lamp, but something quieter than that. A lamp turned low and private, pressing a pale, warm circle against the desk it sat on, and not much further, and yet this light, small as it was, reached the window, and the window sent it downward to the wet cobblestones below, where the rain broke it apart and pulled it back together and broke it apart again, patient and continuous, without complaint, the way certain presences in a street announce themselves not by demanding attention, but simply by persisting, night after night, in the same small, faithful way. Oswin Tredwell sat in that room. He was 43 years old, not young enough to be restless, not old enough to be diminished, suspended in that quiet middle passage of life, where the great ambitions have finally settled and made room for something more durable, where anger has softened into understanding and expectations have been worn down, slowly into a shape that might honestly be called contentment. If anyone had ever tried to describe him, and no one really had, because describing a person requires first noticing them, and attention had a way of sliding past Oswin without stopping, they would have said reliable, perhaps quiet, perhaps they would have simply moved on. He was slightly below average height, his shoulders carrying a gentle forward lean, as though he had spent enough years walking into headwinds that his body had simply arrived at a permanent accommodation with resistance. There was a patience in his posture, a kind of practiced yielding, the look of someone who had long ago decided that the most dignified response to the weight of things was not to straighten against it, but to move forward anyway, steadily, without theater, but seated at his desk with a pen in hand, eyes moving across a column of figures. None of that was visible. In those moments, Oswin was precisely where he was meant to be, and there was a stillness to him then that had nothing to do with passivity, a concentration so complete it made the small room around him feel somehow orderly and sufficient, and if you understood what it meant to be precisely where you were meant to be, you would have recognized that as a quietly remarkable thing. His hair was dark brown with gray settling at both temples, and he had been making his peace with that for a year or two, and had mostly succeeded. Each morning the white threads in the mirror received a brief acknowledgement, the way one notes the weather, and nothing more. Hair went gray. This was simply how it was. There were more important things to attend to. His spectacles had oval lenses in black painted steel, the left earpiece bent at a slight angle from years of use, and his ear had, at some point, without any formal agreement, simply shaped itself around that particular curve. He had occasionally thought about having it straightened, but the thought had never made it past thought, because the glasses worked, and Oswin had no convincing reason to change a thing that worked, which was, in its small way, a faithful portrait of how he approached most things. His desk was the smallest in the office, tucked into the left corner near the narrow window, as though it had tried to take up as little space as possible, and its leather surface had absorbed years of ink and pen pressure until the hide had darkened and softened in all the places that mattered most. To the right sat a wooden pen stand with two steel-nibbed pens, a pencil, and a small glass bottle of ink, wiped clean each evening without exception. Its cap turned twice. Once was never enough for Oswin before being set aside. To the left, a row of ledgers in dark green covers, their spines labeled in small legible handwriting, year, quarter, client. He had learned this system from the senior accountant who had held this office before him, learned it by watching without being taught, and over the years it had settled so completely into his habits that imagining any other way of keeping records had become genuinely difficult. The lamp on his desk was small and made of brass, its upper rim gone green from years of open air, the flame turned down slightly. He had told himself for years that lower light was easier on the eyes, and a doctor had once gently told him this was exactly wrong, and Oswin had retained this information and changed nothing, or perhaps had been unable to change it, and the line between unable and unwilling had always been, for him, a little blurred. The light it cast was a narrow, warm circle on the leather surface, its edges soft, dissolving gradually into the darkness that held everything else: the bookshelves, the umbrella stand, the door frame, in a calm, formless dark. Outside, the rain had been falling since midday, beginning hesitantly, as though testing whether it truly meant to, then settling after 2 o'clock into something steady and decided rhythmic against the roof and the window glass and the cobblestones of Grain Street below, filling the gutters until they ran over, collecting in the gaps between the stones in small traveling streams, and from somewhere further away, the muffled sound of iron-shod wheels on wet stone came and went, a carriage passing somewhere on the larger road, its sound arriving and dissolving, and then nothing but rain again. Oswin heard none of this consciously, or rather he heard it the way one hears one's own heartbeat. It was simply there, behind everything, expected and undemanding, and what demanded his attention was only what lay on the desk before him. Calloway had announced the new accounts at the end of October, standing at the head of the meeting table with the look he always wore on these occasions, spectacles pushed down to the very tip of his nose, as though he found the world slightly easier to assess without them, regarding his 4 accountants with the air of a man who has already made every decision and is asking a question purely to confirm that no one will inconvenience him by having an opinion. 3 new clients, he said: United Northern Coal, Ashworth Textile, and Meridian Carriage Repair. Files by end of week. Everyone happy? And the room had given him the answer it always gave, which was the particular silence of people who have learned that the question is not actually a question, and Calloway had received this silence in the way he always received it, as confirmation that the world remained sensibly arranged, replaced his spectacles, and moved on to the next item as though the pause had not occurred. New accounts meant new ledgers, and new ledgers meant different systems, different habits, different column arrangements that needed checking against the established format, and this meant extra work, extra time, and more to the point, it meant that someone needed to audit the new books and ensure the transition was being handled correctly. That someone, as it almost always was, had turned out to be Oswin. His title was senior accountant, the most experienced in the firm. Though the title had brought him neither a larger office, he had occupied this same small room for 4 years, and the room had not changed, nor any meaningful increase in wages. What it had brought him was responsibility, which in practice meant this: finding other people's mistakes, correcting them quietly, and writing none of it down anywhere official. The ledger opened before him tonight belonged to young Albert Birch, 23, fair-haired, with the slightly fragile look that fair-haired young men sometimes carry, careful with his numbers, polite to everyone in the office. Oswin was fond of him in the way one is fond of a reminder of one's younger self, the version that had tried so hard to do everything correctly and had lain awake some nights convinced it hadn't. Tonight something had gone wrong in Birch's work. The columns for March and April had been transposed, a small confusion, the kind that happens when attention drifts for a moment and the hand goes by habit to the wrong page. Not carelessness, not negligence, simply a moment of distraction that had quietly rippled forward through the figures. The error itself was correctable in minutes, but its consequences left unchecked could have traveled as far as a client's invoice, a small displacement becoming a reported figure becoming a question becoming a meeting becoming a very particular kind of silence in a room, and once it reached a client's invoice, it would reach Calloway, and once it reached Calloway, it would reach Birch, and the fair-haired young man's face would go red under that pale hair, and his careful hands would turn the pages, looking for where it had gone wrong, and the embarrassment of the thing would outlast the error itself by weeks, and all the while the simple truth that the mistake was small and fixable, and had in fact already been fixed before the day began, would comfort no one in that chain. Oswin had seen this sequence before. He had decided some years ago that the most useful place to stop it was at the beginning, before it became a chain at all. He turned the pages carefully, left hand resting lightly at the edge to hold the paper still. The pages were cool under his fingers, as paper always was in these autumn months, and moved the nib of his pen slowly down each column, reading every figure with the unhurried attention of someone for whom numbers had never been abstract. A carriage hired, a bolt of cloth measured and sold, a quantity of coal moved from one place to another. These were real things, done by real hands, and the figures that represented them deserved to be right. When the pen paused, it was either to mark a correction or to move on, and when it marked a correction, it added in the margin a small note explaining the source of the error, which page had caused the confusion, how the verification had been made. Nobody had asked him to write these notes. Calloway probably didn't know they existed, but Oswin had done it this way for 10 years, because the person who opened this ledger next, whoever they turned out to be, deserved to understand what they were looking at. The clock on the wall showed 9:15 when the sound of quick footsteps came up from the street below, someone hurrying through the rain, each step hitting the wet stone with a flat, suppressed splash, there and gone, in a matter of seconds, swallowed back into the sound of the rain, as though the person had never existed. Oswin did not lift his head, but his eyes moved, briefly and without decision, to the narrow window in its dark wooden surround, and he looked at the rain on the glass, drops clinging and merging, forming small rivers that tracked down the pane in crooked, self-correcting lines, and beyond that, the blurred, warm shapes of the street, a window lit somewhere opposite, a lantern someone was carrying, the dark suggestion of a closing shutter. He looked for only a moment, then he went back to the page. Some time later, while he was noting the 5th correction of the evening, something across the street caught his attention. Not a sound, not a movement, but something quieter than either. The kind of thing that announces itself only to someone who happens to be looking in the right direction at the right moment. In one of the first-floor windows of the terrace opposite, behind a thin curtain whose pattern he could not make out, a light was burning. Not a gas lamp. A gas lamp trembled, and its trembling came through fabric, casting a shifting, uncertain glow. But this light was still and warm and even, the kind that comes from a well-built fire in a closed room, or from several candles placed thoughtfully together. And the curtain filtered it into something soft and complete, not so much illuminating the window as giving it a quality it didn't have in darkness, the quality of inhabited, of tended, of a place where someone had made things comfortable for the night and was inside them now, at rest. Oswin held his pen, but did not write. He looked at that light the way a person sometimes looks at a thing without quite meaning to, pulled there by something quieter than curiosity, and he thought a family, most likely, someone at home at this hour, in this warmth, on this street, a table perhaps cleared after dinner, children already in bed under heavy quilts, small and warm and unknowing, or perhaps still gathered, all of them at the fire, saying the last slow things of the day in the way people speak when they are tired and comfortable and have no reason to perform anything for one another, or perhaps not speaking at all, which was its own kind of language, the silence of people who have agreed without negotiation. That silence between them means nothing is wrong. He thought of his own house then, on Debug Lane to the south, the stove he had lit that morning, which was almost certainly cold now, after 8 hours untended, or perhaps holding a last determined bed of embers at its center, small and reduced but not yet surrendered. The pot of soup Elowen had made before midday, leek and potato, with a little thyme, she kept in a small jar on the second shelf, the smell of it always filling the kitchen in a way that seemed to go beyond the cooking itself, settling into the painted wood of the windowsill, into the cloth of the curtain, into the grain of the table, a smell that meant someone had been there, that the kitchen had been used and warmed, and thought about. The soup would be cold by now, but not spoiled. He would light the stove when he got back, and set the pot on the heat and stand beside it while it warmed, and it would take perhaps 10 minutes, and those 10 minutes would be nothing, and then there would be soup. He thought of Elowen. She would be reading most likely, her small lamp lit, feet tucked beneath her in the old wide armchair that had come with the house and had never quite recovered from the years before them, a book or a magazine open across her knees, turning pages with the unhurried patience of someone who would not leave a sentence until she had properly understood it. He had watched her read, sometimes without her knowing, the way her gaze went inward on a good passage, the small, barely visible movement of her lips, the slight lift of one eyebrow when something surprised her. Watching that had always been, for him, a kind of rest. Or perhaps she had already fallen asleep. She was often asleep by 9, and either way was perfectly fine. Either way she was safe, and safe was enough. Safe was everything. The word familiar rose in his thoughts, and stayed there for a moment, turning slowly. Familiar, was it a diminishment? He considered the question honestly, and found that it was not. Familiar meant reliable. Familiar meant that certain fears did not need to be entertained, because certain things could be counted on, not because they had been promised in any formal way, but because they had been demonstrated, quietly and repeatedly, over years. It was the kind of assurance that announced itself in no particular moment, but was simply always there, the way a sound can be present in a room for so long that one only notices it by imagining its absence. He looked at the light across the street one last time, still burning behind its curtain, steady and private, and then he returned to the ledger. He finished Birch's ledger, closed it, and placed it back in the green row on the shelf, with his fingers resting briefly on the spine, a small unconscious gesture, something between an acknowledgement and a farewell, done and finished, then reached for the next file. This was the Ashworth textile account. The factory stood on the north edge of Whitmore, beside the canal, an old wooden building that had taken a small fire 2 years ago. One wing had been rebuilt, and the color difference between old and new timber was still visible from the road. Their records were unnecessarily complicated, 2 systems colliding on the same pages, the old way and the new way, refusing to fully reconcile, the habits of a previous bookkeeper still visible in the column arrangements like the ghost of a hand that no longer held the pen. Oswin understood this, not only as an accounting problem, but as a human one, the kind that showed up in ledger columns, but lived, really, in something much older than bookkeeping. Being accustomed to one way and being asked to abandon it was a difficulty that applied to almost everything a person was, to the arrangements they had made with their own days, the routes they walked without deciding to, the particular order in which they did small things each morning, all of it woven into the body as much as the mind. Habits put down roots that ran invisible and deep, and nobody felt those roots until someone tried to pull them free, and pulling them free required patience, not from the habit, which had no patience and no preferences, but from the person doing the pulling, who had to learn to wait for the new thing to become familiar before they could stop thinking about the old one. Patience was not Oswin's most natural quality, but it was the one he had practiced most, and by now the difference between a natural quality and a deeply practiced one was almost impossible to locate. He worked through the Ashworth columns methodically, marking discrepancies with a small clean bracket in the left margin and transferring them to a separate sheet, a summary of questions that needed answering, a short list to be passed to the factory's management. Nobody had asked him to prepare this list. The responsibility for it had not been assigned to him by anyone. But this was what good accountancy looked like, he thought, not merely finding errors, but presenting their resolution clearly, making the work easier for whoever came next. Who had taught him this? Perhaps his father, perhaps simply years of small experiences accumulating into a way of seeing. He paused on that thought, his pen touching the page without moving. Amos Tredwell had spent most of his life in a small chemist shop in the south end of Whitmore, a modest place. The painted sign above the door faded to near illegibility, the shelves inside lined with glass bottles, each wearing a careful handwritten label. He had opened it every morning and closed it every evening for decades, and in between he had done hundreds of small things that no one had kept a record of. Listening to a difficult customer with complete patience and not a flicker of irritation visible on his face, carrying an elderly woman's bag to the door, quietly keeping a neighbor's account open when the neighbor had no money to pay. He never mentioned any of these things. He never offered them as evidence of anything. He simply did them and moved on to the next thing. Oswin had asked him about this once, standing in the doorway of the shop on an afternoon when he was not yet 20, watching his father polish a large amber bottle, lifting it, wiping it with a cloth, setting it back, lifting the next. He had watched the motion for a while before asking, "Does it matter if no one knows?" His father had put the bottle down and taken his time before answering, not because the answer wasn't ready, but because the answer contained more than one thing, and he preferred to account for all of it before speaking. He said, "Who was supposed to know? God, yourself, or the conscience of the moment?" The answer changes depending on which of those you find sufficient. Oswin had not fully understood it at the time. He had wanted something cleaner, a sentence that would settle the question and organize the world into a legible shape, the kind of answer that a young man could carry like a rule and apply wherever needed. And his father's words were not that kind of answer. They were more like a door left ajar than a door left open, the kind that required you to push further yourself, which at the time had seemed an insufficient response to a sincere question. But in the years since, and especially in evenings like this one, the lamp burning low, the rain outside steady and indifferent, the columns of figures patient before him, the words had grown more comprehensible with use, the way a garment that once felt awkward and too large eventually settles into the body wearing it, until one morning it simply fits, and one cannot quite remember when the change occurred. His pen found the page again. He kept going. Around 9 o'clock he noticed the cold in his fingers, the particular numbness that settled into the pen-holding hand after hours of work in a room that had stopped being warm some time ago. It began always in the same place, the tips of the middle and index fingers, a faint heaviness first, then the skin going slightly stiff, then the sensation of the pen against the page becoming less precise, as though a thin layer of something had been placed between him and the work. The stove had been lit before noon and had been dead for hours, and the warmth it had built into the walls had gradually given itself up to the November air, pressing in through the stones and glass, patient and unhurried, reclaiming the room, the way cold always reclaims a space when no one is feeding the fire. He set down his pen, pushed back his chair, the wood offering its brief commentary, and stretched slowly, forearms forward, fingers splayed wide, feeling the joints reassert themselves. Then he crossed the few steps to the corner where the coal box stood. The box's metal lid was cold to the touch in the way metal always was in these rooms at this hour, a direct and immediate cold that offered no negotiation. Oswin held it anyway, opened it, found a few pieces of coal, enough for the night, exactly enough. He opened the stove door and found what he had half expected. The embers had not gone out. They lay red and orange at the center of the gray ash, patient and contained, as though they had been waiting with full confidence that someone would return to them. The heat struck his face when the door swung open, his cheeks, the skin around his eyes, the tip of his nose. He dropped 2 pieces of coal in and used a metal rod to shift them, and the embers caught, small blue flames first, then orange, then yellow, the fire making its small settling sounds as fresh coal took the heat, and the smoke rose and was drawn upward by the flue, and the room began, very slowly, to warm. He stayed crouched in front of the stove for a few minutes, watching the fire. This was something he did not schedule, and did not decide to do. It simply happened, the way it had always happened for people in cold rooms on dark evenings. The fire drew the eye, and the eye brought the rest of the mind, and for a little while the mind was given nothing to do but watch the flames move. The plans and the figures and the things that needed to be done tomorrow all stepped back a little, not gone, simply quieter, and what remained was only this moment, this warmth, this small and ancient light. Then he straightened, pressed his palms together, felt the heat that had gathered in them and went back to his desk. He finished the Ashworth ledger a little after 10 and noted at the bottom of his summary sheet, in the same small, deliberate handwriting he used for everything, that the second quarter's records showed considerably less confusion than the first. The two systems were beginning to find a common language, the old habits making room for the new ones. The way two people who have disagreed about something gradually, without announcing it, begin to accommodate each other's way of speaking, and he wrote this down because it seemed important to record not only what had gone wrong, but what was beginning to go right, because a ledger that showed only errors told only half the story, and half the story was not sufficient for anyone who needed to understand what they were actually looking at. He stacked the papers in order, closed the file, and placed it beside Birch's ledger on the shelf, their spines aligned to the same invisible line that Oswin's eye had established years ago and had never needed to measure since. Then he opened the right-hand drawer of his desk. It stuck slightly, as it always did when it had rained, the wood swelling with the absorbed damp, pressing against the frame on the left side, so that a straight pull was never quite enough. And he applied the small learned correction he had developed so gradually he couldn't have said when it had become habit. A slight sideways lean, a particular angle of the wrist, and then the gentle tug, and the drawer gave, as it always gave, releasing with the same brief resistance it always offered before yielding, and inside, arranged in no particular system, but with the casual familiarity of things long undisturbed, lay a spare pen still in its paper wrapping, a seal with a blue wax stopper, 2 business cards whose edges had softened and curled with time, and beneath all of this, pressed flat by the weight of what sat above it, and by 3.5 years of being left where it was, a folded envelope whose white had long since gone the pale cream of something kept but not even once, forgotten. He had put it there on a February morning, a sharp and strange February, very cold, but with sun on the snow-covered rooftops, the kind of winter light that made everything look more real than usual. He had opened this drawer for something else, a pen or a piece of string, and had placed the envelope inside and closed the drawer, and it had been there ever since, taken out every few months, read, returned. He took it out now, on the front in his father's handwriting, careful, slightly unsteady in those last months, but still recognizably his, still carrying the character of the hand that had labeled all those bottles. It said, "For Oswin," not for O. Tredwell, not simply for my son, for Oswin. This small particularity stopped him for a moment each time he saw it, the same half-second pause, the same quiet wait. He unfolded the letter. The paper was worn at the creases, soft from handling, with a small tear in the upper right corner that had been there almost from the beginning. The smell that had once lived in the paper, ink, or the wood of his father's shelves, or simply the particular atmosphere of that chemist's shop that he had spent half his childhood breathing, was almost entirely gone now. He still looked for it each time found only the faint neutral smell of old paper, and each time continued reading anyway. His father had written about small things, the cold that winter, the frost on the shop windows in the mornings, the chestnut seller on the corner who had given him a whole bag without being asked, the neighbor's cat who had produced 4 kittens, 3 of whom had found homes. These details had always seemed to Oswin like the truest kind of generosity, a letter that said, "I am still here, and here is what the world looks like from where I stand." And then, about halfway down the second page, "There is something I have wanted to say to you, and words are sometimes not the right tool, which is why I am writing it instead. Doing the right thing, doing it even when no one is watching, has always made me glad. I see this in you, and you know by now how rare a thing it is." Oswin stopped reading. He always stopped at these lines. He looked up from the page and looked at the lamp, its flame small and even, barely moving, and waited for a few seconds while something settled in him, some small internal shifting that he could feel but could not have accurately named. Then he looked at the window. The light across the street was still there, still burning behind its curtain. The rain on the glass was still making its slow rivers. He folded the letter back along its existing creases and placed it in the envelope, and put the envelope in the drawer and closed it, turning the drawer shut with the same learned pressure, and sat for a moment in the silence of the room. He began to tidy the desk. This was a ritual, not a task. It followed the same sequence every night, without variation, and the sequence itself was a kind of closing, each step marking the end of one thing and the beginning of another. Papers first, completed ones into their files, blank ones into the lower drawer, anything still ink wet set aside to dry before being moved. Then the pens, ink bottle cap turned twice, pens wiped and replaced in the stand. Then the ledgers, already shelved, but he ran his eye across their spines anyway to confirm the alignment. Then the desk surface itself, a small cloth kept in the bottom left drawer, used for nothing else, passed once across the leather to lift the dust and the stray ink. The whole thing took perhaps 6 minutes, unhurried, and the unhurriedness was deliberate. There was no reason to rush, and so there would be no rushing. He put on his coat. It was dark brown wool, heavy and slightly thinner at the shoulders than it had once been, the lining repaired twice in the past 3 years. It had a smell of long use about it, not unpleasant, a smell of familiar cold and familiar warmth. He held it for a moment before putting it on, both hands gripping the collar, feeling the weight of it. Wool was a substantial thing, a holding thing, and when he put it on, it would hold him back, pressing warmth slowly inward over the first few minutes of walking. He put it on, left arm first, then right, and did the buttons from the top down, each one seated before moving to the next, in the order he had always done them for reasons he had never examined, and saw no need to examine. Now, he took his hat from the stand, black, round-brimmed, the body slightly softened from its original stiffness, but still holding its shape, put it on, and crossed to the small mirror on the ground floor to confirm that everything was in order. The reflection was dim and adequate, a man in a coat and hat, ready to walk home through a November night. He returned to his office, turned down the lamp, and watched the flame go through its small crisis, a trembling, a shrinking, a last orange pulse before going out. The room changed immediately. The stove's glow remained, a low red through the cast iron grate, and faint light came from the corridor below. But his desk was dark now, the ledgers dark, the leather surface dark, all of it belonging to morning now, which was where it was supposed to be. He walked out, the floorboards speaking as he crossed them, a familiar vocabulary, the second board nearest the window, always the most insistent, a particular creak he could have identified blindfolded among 100 others, and he understood this sound, the way one understands a thing that has been said in the same way so many times. It has become a greeting. I am here, you are here, everything continues. He locked the door behind him, the key turning with its clean metallic certainty, and stood for a moment in the dark corridor with all the other locked doors along it, and the wall clocks ticking now closed away behind one of them, and from somewhere far below and far outside, only the sound of rain. The front door of the building was heavy oak, deep framed, with a small glass panel set in an iron grill near the top. Through this panel the street was visible, the rain, the far building fronts, the unsteady gold of the gas lamps. He took hold of the iron knocker and pulled the door open, and the night entered, cold, wet-smelling, real in the abrupt way that outside air always is after hours indoors. It touched his face first, his forehead, his cheeks, the sides of his nose, and he stood there in the doorway for a moment, at the precise border between the building's warmth and the night's cold, not quite in either place, existing briefly in the thin line between them. Then he stepped out, pulled the door shut behind him, heard the latch catch, and descended the 2 stone steps to the street. Before turning south toward home, he looked across the street, the window with the curtained light, the one he had watched from upstairs, the one with the warm and private glow that had made him think of families at rest, was dark now. All the windows in that building were dark, indistinguishable from each other, all closed and quiet. They had gone to bed, whoever they were. The children first, then the parents moving from room to room, extinguishing lamps in that particular sequence that ends a day. And Oswin found that this did not sadden him. Rather, it produced something stranger and quieter, something close to peace. They were home, they were safe, and he was going home now too, and everyone, more or less, was where they should be. He turned south and walked. Each step on the wet cobblestones produced that particular November sound, heavy and slightly dull, the sound of water and stone meeting at a cold temperature, a sound that belonged to no other season, and that Whitmore's streets gave back most faithfully in the last weeks of autumn, when the stones were fully saturated and had stopped pretending otherwise. The rain fell on the brim of his hat in small rapid taps, individual and then continuous, and darkened the shoulders of his coat within the first half-minute, the wool going several shades deeper as it took the damp inward. The gas lamps ahead cast their trembling orange onto the street's surface, and the surface gave it back in broken, shifting reflections that moved as he moved, keeping a loose and distorted pace beside him. He put his hands into his coat pockets, not clenched, simply resting inside the dry warmth that still lingered there, and he walked at his ordinary pace, unhurried, because hurrying in this kind of rain served no purpose that he had ever been able to identify. The shop fronts along his route were all closed and dark, the butcher's wide boards down, the drapery's large window showing only his own blurred reflection passing across it, a pale coat and a round-brimmed hat moving through gaslight. From one chimney above a terrace house, smoke was coming, and the wind, low and persistent, not violent, the kind of wind that simply leans against things, was bending the smoke sideways and pulling it apart before it could climb. Watching it disperse, Oswin thought about how difficult it was to watch anything dissolve without feeling something, though the feeling was not exactly sadness, more like its gentler cousin, a recognition of passing, not unwelcome, almost sweet. He reached the small stone bridge where Grain Street crossed the drainage channel, and his footsteps slowed without any conscious instruction from him, simply slowed, and his right hand reached for the iron railing, cold and slightly rough with the beginnings of rust, and he stopped and looked down. The channel was running fast tonight, much faster than its usual quiet trickle. The day's rain had filled it, and the water moved with an assurance it didn't ordinarily have, pale and quick at the edges where foam had gathered, dark and rapid in the center. The sound of it rose and spread across the bridge and the nearby stones, larger than the stream itself, and Oswin stood and listened to it fully, not thinking about anything in particular, not planning the remainder of the evening, simply here, simply listening, while the water moved below and the rain came down above, and for a little while he was entirely present in a moment that required nothing of him at all. He took his hand from the railing and walked on. The streets narrowed as he moved further from the center, the houses on both sides leaning slightly inward, the lampposts more widely spaced, the long dark stretches between them where the rain became invisible and only its sound remained. He passed a woman hurrying in the opposite direction under a small umbrella that was doing only partial work against the wind, and they exchanged a nod of the kind that two people exchange when they are both out in the same bad weather and have silently agreed this counts as something shared. Then she was gone, and the street was his again, and the lights in the upper windows were mostly out, and the lower ones mostly dim, and the town around him was at its most itself, ordinary and quiet, and alive in the way that places are alive when almost everyone in them is asleep. Debagal Lane appeared on his left, a narrower street with uneven paving that had never quite been corrected and probably never would be. The stones set at slightly different heights, so that a person walking it in the dark learned its small steps and rises by feel, over time, the way one learns a piece of music by playing it until the hands know it, without being told. It had the smell of the old tannery still, even years after the tannery itself had become something else. That particular combination of water and treated hide and old timber that had soaked so deeply into the soil and the walls of the lane that no change of occupation could entirely displace it. He turned into it, counted the houses without meaning to. This was simply what the body did after sufficient repetition, and found the third from the corner, yellow cream render, 4 windows, the paint on the door the same dark green it had been when they moved in, somewhat faded now at the edges where the light caught it. All 4 windows were dark, no lamp burning anywhere that he could see. He took the key from his coat pocket. He could find it among the other things by touch alone, by the particular weight of it and the small worn nick on the bow that his thumb always located first, fitted it to the lock, and turned it. The mechanism moved with the slightly deliberate resistance of a lock that had been rained on for years but still functioned faithfully, and then the door opened, and what came out was warmth. Not a flood of it, not a dramatic rush of heat, but a real and genuine warmth nonetheless, the particular temperature of a house that has held a person inside it all day, that has absorbed the heat of a morning fire and the smaller heat of a body going from room to room, to the warmth that walls hold when they are given something to hold. It came against his face and hands gently, the way a good thing sometimes arrives, without announcement, simply present. He removed his boots just inside the door, bending to loosen the laces with wet fingers that fumbled slightly, and set the boots on the wooden rack to the right. He hung his hat on the hook. It was heavy with rain, and its familiar weight on his hand was now the weight of a wet thing, and then his coat, which dripped several drops onto the floor, small dark circles on the boards that he noted and did not worry about. He stood in the entrance in his stockinged feet, and the house was very quiet around him, the sounds of outside now reduced to the rain on the kitchen window, and a faint creak somewhere in the upper floor, the house adjusting to the cold as it did each night, tightening its timbers like a person pulling a blanket closer. In the kitchen, the soup pot was on the cold stove, where Elowin had left it, a large cast-iron pot, its lid sitting slightly ajar, and when Oswin lifted the lid, he found leek and potato soup, thick and cold, the surface unbroken, a faint smell of thyme still present even now. He lit the stove, a match drawn, the small surprised jump of the flame, the burner catching and steadying, and set the pot on it. He stood by the stove while the kitchen was still cold around him, and waited without impatience. There was nothing requiring impatience here, nothing that needed to be done faster than it was being done. The soup began to move at the edges first, the way liquids always do, heat finding the perimeter before the center. He spooned soup into a blue cup. It was cracked at the rim, but sound enough, a fine hairline fracture that ran from the lip to just below the glaze in a path no wider than a thread, and he had always preferred it to the larger bowls for reasons of warmth and proportion, the way it fit so naturally into both hands at once, the way its modest size kept the heat contained and close, and carried it to the small kitchen table, moving through the low amber light of the single lamp that burned on the shelf above the basin, its flame steady and unhurried, casting a warm pool across the table's worn surface where the grain of the wood had been smoothed by years of meals and elbows and the quiet patience of ordinary evenings, and he sat down on the wooden chair that had never been comfortable and had never needed to be, its back a little too upright, its seat a little too shallow, a chair that had always asked something small of the person sitting in it, a minor tax on comfort that he had long since stopped resenting. He held the cup in both hands, not drinking immediately, simply holding it while the heat moved through the ceramic into his palms and from his palms into his fingers, each one warming separately and slowly, the sensation spreading upward through his wrists and into the tendons of his forearms, with the unhurried deliberateness of warmth that is nowhere else to be, the cold of the evening of the rain, and the stone bridge, and the long walk home, retreating by degrees from his knuckles, from the creases of his palms, from the tips of his fingers where the chill had settled most stubbornly. Then he drank, in unhurried mouthfuls, each one small and considered, the soup tasting of the onion and the bone and the bay leaf he had dropped in that morning before leaving, the hours of slow heat having deepened everything into a flavor that was not complicated but was entirely sufficient, and he felt the warmth travel down and outward through him in a slow, patient wave, and something in his posture, in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw, released without announcement, without his having asked it to, without his even having known that it had been held. He did not notice it happen. It simply happened, the way things do when the body finally receives what it has been waiting for, without ceremony, without any need to mark the moment, as quietly as a door settling into its frame. He washed the cup at the sink with the cold water that came from the tap in the particular thin stream. It always produced at this hour of the night, a narrow, steady thread of water, slightly too cold for comfort, but entirely sufficient for the task, striking the bottom of the basin with a sound like a soft, continuous whisper, and he turned the cup slowly beneath it, working the cloth into the interior with the patient attention of someone who has washed the same cup enough times to have developed a particular method for it, a sequence of movements so familiar it required nothing from his conscious mind, and left his thoughts free to drift across the kitchen, across the smell of extinguished candles and cooling soup, and the faint mineral scent of the cold water itself. He dried it with the cloth that hung from the nail beside the basin, a cloth of undyed linen, worn to a softness that new cloth cannot achieve, its edges slightly frayed from years of use, and returned it to its place on the shelf, third from the left, exactly where it had always been, nestled between the larger brown mug that belonged to Elowin and the small tin cup he kept for mornings when he needed something with a handle that wouldn't mind being carried from room to room, and he set it down with the small, precise satisfaction of returning a thing to its proper place, the quiet completion of an arrangement that had existed long enough to feel like intention. He extinguished the kitchen stove, turning the valve with the slight resistance it always offered before releasing, confirmed the pot had been moved off the heat and placed on the trivet where it would cool without mishap, wiped the surface of the stove with the cloth that lived beside the basin and served no other purpose, working from left to right as he always did, smoothing away the faint residue of steam and the small marks left by the pot's base. Then he picked up his small traveling lamp, the one he used for moving through the house after dark, its flame just large enough to illuminate the next few steps, housed in a simple brass case with a hinged glass panel that had developed a small rattle he had always meant to fix and never had, and went to the foot of the stairs. The staircase rose steeply, as it always had, its banister of dark wood, polished smooth along the upper edge by years of ascending and descending hands, the wallpaper beside it, a pattern of faded green that had been there before he arrived and would likely remain long after. He placed his foot on the first step, and the house spoke back to him in its nightly way, the first step low and certain, firm beneath his weight, in a way that felt almost reassuring. The second thinner and higher, producing its familiar note, a sound between a creak and a sigh, a small exhalation from the timber. The third barely more than a breath, a whisper of wood flexing and returning, a three-note conversation he had been having with these boards for years, without ever once thinking of it as anything less than ordinary, or anything less than his. He stopped at the bedroom door, which stood a few inches open, exactly as he had left it that morning when he had paused in the doorway and glanced back at the room before going out, the light then early and gray and coming in through the gap at the curtain's edge. The room still holding the warmth and quietness of sleep, already something he had been moving away from toward the day. Inside now, in the soft, complete dark, Elowin was asleep, her hair a dark auburn shape against the white of the pillow, spread out with the looseness that comes only in genuine sleep, one hand visible at the edge of the blanket, its fingers slightly curled, the posture of a hand that has released everything it was holding and asked for nothing in return, her breathing slow and even and entirely peaceful, moving through the stillness of the room with the steady, unhurried quality of water over smooth stone, the particular deep rhythm of someone who has gone under properly and not merely dozed, whose body has committed itself fully to the night. And he stood in the doorway without entering, holding the lamp low at his side so its light would fall against the floor in a warm crescent that did not reach the bed, did not touch her face or disturb the darkness she rested in. And he looked at her for a moment, for the span of several quiet breaths, not with anything complicated, not with any thought that required attention or examination, not with nostalgia or longing, or the particular ache of love examined too closely, but simply with the recognition that this was here, and this was real, and this was his, and something in the ordinary completeness of it, the dark room, the quiet breathing, the hand at the edge of the blanket, was sufficient in a way that asked for nothing further, required no addition, admitted no improvement. Good, he thought, just that, good. He pulled the door closed behind him with the care of someone who has learned, over many years, exactly how much pressure is required to seat a latch without sound. The final inch drawn slowly, the latch eased into its housing with a barely audible click, no more. He went to the small sitting room, which was also the library, its walls on one side lined with books, most of them Eloin's, a quarter his, all of them familiar in the way things are familiar when you have lived alongside them long enough to know them by their spines, without reading the titles, the green cloth binding of the trollop volumes she favored, the row of slender gray pamphlets he had accumulated over years of careful purchase, a few with names written in pencil on their spines and handwriting he could read without looking, and the room smelled as it always smelled of the books themselves, a dry, faintly sweet smell that was part paper and part dust, and part the particular quality of air that gathers in rooms where reading happens quietly over many years, and beneath that the smell of the grate, of old ash and cold stone, waiting. He lit a small fire in the grate, enough for the night, built unhurriedly, the kindling first, the dry pine he kept in the box beside the hearth, 2 thin sticks of oak laid across at an angle, not too much, not an ambitious fire, a modest one appropriate to the hour, and sat in his chair, the one that had been his long enough to carry the impression of him in its cushion and its armrests, the fabric on the right armrest slightly more worn where his hand rested when he read, and he placed his hands on his knees and did nothing. The fire found its voice after a minute, small cracklings at first, the sound of new wood taking heat, releasing its moisture in small snapping sounds, then the deeper pulse of something beginning to settle into itself, a steadier, lower sound, the sound of combustion becoming confident, and with it the first perceptible warmth reaching across the short distance to where he sat, and touching his face, and the backs of his hands very gently, very tentatively, as a warmth beginning to establish itself always does. Rain on the roof, distant now, further away than it had been all evening, as though the house had agreed to keep it at a certain remove, to let it continue without troubling the interior, and the ordinary sounds of the building itself, the night sounds of timber and plaster, the faint adjustments of a structure settling in the cold, familiar as breathing, familiar as the particular quiet that this room had always held at this hour. He sat there and thought nobody had seen what he had done tonight. Nobody had been in the office when he had set the lamp on the corner of the larger desk and pulled his own ledger out from beneath it. Nobody had been present when he had begun the first column and worked through it with the patience that the task demanded. Nobody had watched him hold the nib over the paper for a moment before a correction, weighing the mark he was about to make. Nobody would know the 5 errors he had found and corrected, small ones, the kind that announce themselves only to those who have been looking long enough and carefully enough to see them. A transposed figure in one column, a sum carried incorrectly from the previous week, 3 smaller miscalculations that would have compounded quietly into something larger by the end of the month if left unaddressed, and nobody would know the careful notes he had written in the margins in his small consistent hand, the hours he had spent on a task that was nobody else's responsibility, but that had belonged, undeniably, to him, the way things belong to you, not because you have claimed them, but because no one else was going to do them, and you knew how. And he turned this over in the quiet of the sitting room, the way his father had once turned a bottle in his hands before putting it back on its shelf, deliberately, without hurry, the same movement repeated until the object was fully examined, not performing the thought, not arranging it for an audience, it would never have, but just examining it honestly in the private space of his own mind, the way a man can examine something only when no one is watching and the fire is low and the night has settled around him completely. Did it matter if nobody knew? He found, as he always found, that the answer was not complicated and did not require long consideration. The ledgers were right now. The figures would hold through the week, through the month, through whatever accounting was eventually required of them, and they would hold correctly and cleanly and without the quiet rot of an error left to compound in the dark. Birch would come in tomorrow morning and open his book and find nothing amiss, and he would not know why this was so, because there was no reason he should, because the correction was the kind of thing that left no trace of the corrector, only of the correctness, and Oswin would not tell him. And this was, in its quiet and particular way, entirely sufficient, not a sacrifice, not a noble act, not anything that required the vocabulary of virtue, simply work done, a thing made right, the night's proper business completed. He sat a while longer, watching the fire settle through its stages, the early bright crackle of the kindling spending itself, then the steadier, lower burn of the oak beginning to establish its own character, the flames shortening and thickening and turning from yellow to a deeper amber at their base, the wood's surface darkening and beginning to glow, feeling the room grow incrementally warmer around him, the warmth accumulating in the air, the way warmth does in small rooms with low ceilings, gathering first near the grate and then spreading slowly outward until it reached the corners and the books on their shelves and the fabric of the chair where he sat, and the cold that had lived in the room since evening, gradually yielding, degree by degree, without haste, without announcement. And then he turned down the lamp until it was barely aglow, the flame reduced to the smallest possible thread of amber light that still counted as light, and carried it with him to the bedroom, moving through the dark corridor with the ease of long familiarity, his hand finding the bedroom door without needing to look. He undressed in the dark by habit, each step known so well it required nothing from his conscious mind. The jacket first, folded and set over the chair back, the waistcoat, the shirt, each item placed with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been performing this sequence in this room long enough that his hands know what to do before he has thought to direct them. He eased back the covers and got into bed, the mattress receiving his weight with its familiar slight give, and arranged the quilt, heavy and wool-warm, washed so many times it had gone past softness into something closer to the texture of forgiveness, its pattern of faded squares no longer distinguishable in the dark, but known to his hands, known to the pressure of his fingers along its surface, and pulled it up around his shoulders with the care of someone tucking themselves in, someone settling into a thing they have earned. The ceiling was low and pale, visible in the faint ambient dark of a room that was almost but not entirely lightless. From outside the rain continued, though it had slowed, as rain does in the small hours, losing its conviction, becoming something more like a murmur, a sound remembered rather than heard. Elowin's breathing was beside him, slow and deep, and entirely peaceful, moving through the silence of the room with the steadiness of something that has its own rhythm and does not require any encouragement to maintain it, a sound so unhurried it seemed to come from somewhere below ordinary breath, from a deeper register of rest. He listened to it as he had listened to the stream on the bridge, fully and without purpose, without trying to do anything with the listening, without it needing to mean anything beyond the simple fact of itself, and gradually, without any decision on his part, without any effort or intention, his own breathing found the same pace, the interval between the inward and the outward breath, lengthening and deepening until it matched hers, the way one instrument in a quiet room tunes itself to another simply by being present and still long enough. He thought of his father's words, doing it even when no one is watching. He heard the voice as it had always been, even and dry, and without emphasis, as if what was being said required no particular weight from the words themselves, only the truth of them, and the voice was clearer to him now, here in the dark, than it had been in years, than it had been in the office or on the bridge, or standing in the doorway of his daughter's room. He thought of the amber bottle being lifted and wiped and returned, the slight deliberateness of that gesture. its absolute privacy, performed for no audience, requiring none. He thought of the second stair-step, high and clear in the night's silence, the third barely a whisper beneath his foot, the three-note exchange between himself and the house that asked nothing of him and needed nothing except his presence on it, evening after evening, year after year. He thought of the rain on the bridge and the fire and the warmth that had come through the ceramic into his hands, warming each finger separately and slowly, and all these things were true, and all of them were ordinary, and all of them were enough, and one by one they grew quieter and quieter in him, losing their edges, their details softening, their colors dimming, the way a room grows quieter as the last lamp goes down, and the darkness that fills in behind it is not an absence but a kind of rest. And then they were gone, all of it, the ledgers, the figures, the cold in his fingers that had been there when he arrived, and was gone now entirely, his father's voice with its dry and even quality, the curtained light across Grain Street that had burned steadily and then gone dark without drama, all of it somewhere behind him now, real and intact and kept, belonging to the day that had already become the past, held there safely in the completed hours where nothing could alter it, but no longer present in any way that required his attention, belonging to a different layer of the night, a layer further down, and what remained in its place was something that had no particular content, only quality. The weight of the quilt settled across his shoulders and chest, substantial and warm. The warmth gathered patiently beneath it, the accumulated warmth of the bed itself, which had been waiting for him, which had kept his half of it at the precise temperature of long habitation, the sound of Eloin's breathing beside him, a sound so familiar it had long since ceased to be something he noticed and had become instead simply part of what silence meant in this house, woven into the texture of the room's quiet, the way the smell of the books was woven into the sitting room's air, present without requiring acknowledgement, part of what rest meant, part of what it felt like to be in the right place at the right hour, doing the right thing, which was nothing, which was only this. The rain outside was very quiet now, nearly gone, or perhaps only very far away, retreating across the town to wherever rain goes, when the night has had enough of it, and the fire in the sitting room was settling into itself with small sounds that barely reached this room, faint cracklings, the occasional shift of a log, sounds that were more felt than heard, vibrations in the fabric of the house rather than proper sounds in the air, and they asked nothing of him, required nothing, were simply the house conducting its own business at the edge of his awareness. And Oswin slept. It was the sleep of a day honestly used, work done carefully, and without performance, without an audience, without expectation of acknowledgement, a life conducted in the particular register of those who do not need to be seen, doing good in order to do it, who have never required the doing to be witnessed in order for it to count. Deep and untroubled, the sleep of a man who knows the ledgers are right, and the fire is low, and the door is closed, and the woman beside him breathes in the dark with the patience of the long settled. Nothing was required of the night now, nothing at all. Outside, Grain Street glistened in the aftermath of the rain, the wet cobblestones catching the light of the gas lamps and holding it in long, wavering reflections that ran in the direction of the gutter's slow current. Amber light, broken into a dozen smaller lights across the irregular surfaces of the stone, each cobble holding its own small version of the lamp above it, and the rain kept falling still, quieter now, much slower, the kind of rain that has made its point and is finishing with a kind of grace, letting itself diminish without abruptness, the drops further apart, the sound on the cobblestones more intermittent, the intervals between one drop and the next growing longer and more contemplative, as if the rain were taking its time and ending the way a piece of music sometimes takes its time before the final note, not hurrying toward the silence but approaching it with care. The gutters ran their slow courses, carrying the night's rain toward the lower part of the town where the stream ran under the stone bridge and continued east toward wherever it went, beyond the houses, beyond the last lane and the last lamp, into the country dark. And the little town of Whitmore breathed in the dark, all of it, every shop with its shutter drawn and its lock turned, every lamp turned low or extinguished, every hearth settling toward embers, the ash paling, the coals cooling from orange to red to the deep, quiet gray that is not yet cold, but is no longer hot, every household contained in its own particular silence, the particular arrangement of its own particular dark, and on Debagal Lane, the third house from the corner, its render the color of old cream, its 4 windows all dark and still, its front steps slightly uneven, where the mortar had shifted years ago. In that house a man slept. He was not important in any way that the world tends to measure importance. He was not celebrated, not positioned at the center of anything, not someone toward whom the attention of the town bent itself with any particular frequency. He had simply done his work correctly, in the quiet of an office and the pale light of a lamp, gone home through the rain with his collar up, warmed his hands on a cracked blue cup, and closed his eyes, and that was enough. That had always been enough. That in the end, if you looked at it plainly and honestly, and without requiring it to be more than it was the whole of it. And now you too, let go, just as Oswin let go, not all at once, not with effort, but in the way a held breath is released when the body finally remembers it, no longer needs to hold it. Whatever you did today, you did it. You moved through the hours in the way that was yours to move through them. Perhaps no one noticed the particular care you brought to something small. Perhaps no one said thank you for the thing that cost you more than it appeared to. That is all right. These things still happened. They are real, and they are done, and they belong to the day now, and the day is complete. You know what you did, and sometimes that is the only thing that needs to be true, the private knowledge of a thing done, held quietly, asked for nothing, requiring no witness. Feel your body now, exactly as it is, the weight of the blanket across your shoulders, the warmth that has gathered beneath it from the heat of your own presence, the way the pillow has taken the shape of your head, shaped itself around you with the patience of something that has been waiting for exactly this. Let your shoulders fall just a little further than they already have. Let your jaw soften, let your hands open, fingers loose, palms turned gently toward whatever comes. Breathe in, slowly, deeply, all the way to the bottom of the breath. Hold it for just a moment, just long enough to feel the stillness at the center of it, and let it go, all of it with it. Today is finished. It is sealed and done, and held in the past where it belongs, and it will not reopen tonight. Tomorrow exists, but not yet, not here, not in this dark that is your dark, the particular dark of your room and your warmth. Right now there is only this quiet, the warmth around you, patient and still, the sleep that is already arriving, already closer than it was a moment ago, closer with each breath, with each softening, with each small thing you release. Close your eyes. If they are not already closed, let it come. You have earned it. Good night.